Welcome to the special edition of Standard Bank Talks, where today we are joined by Goolam Ballim, the Chief Economist of Standard Bank. Unfortunately, my co-host Funeka Monjane is not in, but she'll be back in a couple of episodes' time. And the reason why we're focusing on this upcoming weekend, we have the Kingsmead Book Fair, and we thought one of the panelists who will be attending is, of course, Goolam Ballim. And Goolam, thank you so much for coming through and joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here.
At the fair, which we're very excited about, I think one of the panels you're speaking about is generally about geopolitical influences on the market, or something of that relation. And this year has been quite the year for everyone. Since January, when Trump basically took office, the world has kind of been spinning. How do you read what's going on? And does this freak you out as much as it does myself? Yeah.
Around the world is coming to an end. At least that's how it feels sometimes. But we have been forewarning for some time, and we don't say this with any conceit, but there's been numerous structural changes that have been enveloping the world for some time. We're certainly shifting from the multilateral calm of the last 30 years, more or less, to a more contentious era. And there are a variety of additional forces, whether it's climate change, technology, ideological swings, say from extremism with regard to liberalism to now extreme illiberalism and intolerance. So these are what we would call sweeping forces that have been in play for some time and have simply galvanized so much more. And certainly President Trump has been catalytic in that process.
And you've been at the bank, we were speaking early on, I don't want to say how long, but you've been at the bank, you've seen a few crises, 2008, 2011 European sovereign debt crisis. In terms of all those big hallmark events in the past, in the 21st century at least, where do you pit what's going on right now in your own thinking, in your own team's thinking?
I've seen a few movies over the years, certainly. The global financial crisis of 2008 and 9 was certainly substantial, momentous. Crudely, one could say that it was double the garden variety recession of the previous 30 or 40 years, and certainly the worst since the Second World War. This certainly is meaningful. I would argue it's probably not as piercing as COVID-19, shock to the global psyche and to the global economy, but certainly worse so far with regard to initial market reactions than the global financial crisis more than a decade and a half ago.
And that crisis, when everything you read, kind of everyone points back to 2008 and almost a distrust then between, I guess, up to that point, the global economy was flying, the 1990s came, the end of the Cold War, and so everything looked rather rosy. I remember a young self, South Africa was a Thabo Mbeki era. Everything looked uplifting, but 2008 is kind of marked out as that fracture. Would you also agree with that in 2008, and what happened then that has caused this almost as anti-globalization forces we've seen unfold, which I guess Donald Trump is merely a symptom of?
Ron, I agree. At least in the South Africa context, the early 2000s was a golden era in South Africa, and of course it was rudely interrupted by the global financial crisis. The GFC, as we call it, in fact caused roughly 80% of the GDP-producing world to fall into recession, South Africa included. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that we look to episodes like that for some level of guidance. Admittedly, this is different, and there is usually difference in terms of the genesis of a shock. This is policy choices that President Trump has made with regard to America's role and place in the world in terms of American trade. And South Africa particularly is in the crosshairs unusually, uniquely, because there is an executive order that was passed early February that also put South Africa in the crosshairs. But in short, everywhere we've had to trim our GDP growth forecast for 2025. Just as a rule of thumb, we've reduced forecast most places by around 0.5 of a percentage point. Now, that is not severe, but at the same time, it's certainly hardly justified to say that it's mere mild changes. And of course, the policy choices of the United States and the White House in particular are going to linger for a long time. So there may be near-term settlement, near-term calm, reconciliation between various nations and the United States, particularly around trade. But I do think that Donald Trump, the president, has perhaps untethered America from the rest of the world in a manner where there is going to be greater adjustments with regard to national independence from various nations around the world.
I think it was last week, a couple of weeks ago, Warren Buffett called these tariffs basically an act of war in itself, to a degree. Would you also, in a similar manner, what are your thoughts about these trade tariffs and these that Trump has championed? I think he's stepping back a bit from it. Right.
So I would argue that unfettered open markets are not necessarily ideal, because there are winners and there are certainly some that are left behind. That said, on the whole, liberalization, open markets, deregulation, to an extent, these have all been hallmarks of the last 30 years or so. And I would argue that in the last 30 years, never before have so many benefited by so much, and especially in emerging markets. So there's been enormous catch-up by the so-called global south over the last 30 years as a function of integration of capital markets, labor markets, and of course also trade. And now that is reversing. And you could argue, if you're a little bit cynical, that we've shifted from a unipolar world of the early 1990s, where the US dominated, to a multipolar world. And you could also be a little bit cynical and say the US is seeing its empire decline, and this is an attempt, a bold attempt, to arrest that decline.
Almost an emergency. As you were saying early on, emerging markets benefit from this past 30-odd years. So South Africa, of course, being in that basket of nations, and of China being the prime one. In this shift, where are emerging markets going to play? How does South Africa, particularly speaking to this country at least, how do we play this shift, and how do we come out of it, survive out of it in truth?
So you're correct in suggesting that there should be somewhat of a defensive posture, somewhat of a recalibration. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, it enjoys a trade to GDP ratio of 50%. In other words, international trade, or even trade with the rest of the continent, is about equivalent to half of the region's GDP. And so it alludes to the notion that trade has been very significant in elevating individual incomes, per capita incomes. And the fact that there are now these impediments, therefore, does pose some challenge, some headwind. My sense is that there is the potential now for the global north, excluding the United States, to throw its arms around the global south more assertively, and for nations like South Africa or other African nations to strengthen ties with the East, with the Middle East, and even attempt to find increased solidarity with, say, Europe. I am not at all suggesting that relationships with the United States should be severed. I'm not going to push the idea that cross-Atlantic ties are unimportant. They are. America is an economy with enormous heft, accounting for about 20% of GDP. It's certainly impactful by virtue of its global policy influence. The dollar is still manifestly an important currency, and so relations with the United States are important. But navigating that and establishing bilateral and mutual favor will be arduous for some nations, but it'll be a critical theme over the course of 2025, which even South Africa and the rest of the continent must pursue, especially against the backdrop of AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which was a unilateral dispensation to the extent that it provided many African countries with duty-free access to the United States for certain products without the need for reciprocity on the part of Africa. And of course, that's changing now, but navigable.
Speaking back to the U.S.-South African relations, and AGOA in particular, I think over 60% of that trade is with South Africa primarily. I know Ramaphosa, our President Ramaphosa is about to meet the U.S. President pretty soon. Why do you think, why is the South Africa so much in the crosshairs? I mean, we are rather small fish in a big pond of this global economy. Why are we just there in their zeitgeist? Is it because of the BRICS alliance and so on. But just why, in your thinking, and how should standard bankers think about this?
Ron, you are correct in highlighting that South Africa seems to be disproportionately assailed by the White House, especially given that it's eminently dispensable in terms of the US's international relationships. And as I said at the beginning, there's an executive order that has highlighted several themes that seems to have invited umbrage on the part of President Trump. There is some suggestion that perhaps South Africa's case at the ICJ, or South Africa initiating and pioneering that endeavor to hold Israel to account with regard to what's alleged to be a travesty and tragedy taking place in that markets, is a significant theme that has perhaps triggered this level of assailing. But in our correspondence with diplomats at the United States consulate, for instance, we are reminded that the United States is taking a portfolio approach. In other words, all of the themes that have been addressed, whether it is trade, whether it is, for example, South Africa's transformation agenda, our land redistribution program, these are all things that are perhaps question marks in the eyes of President Trump that we will need to address. That doesn't mean we need to walk back on every single item or select items. And I suspect there is going to continue to be fissures around a few themes that we are going to have to engage the United States. And I guess that is why it's called diplomacy, to perhaps find some middle grounds potentially to be able to establish a new equilibrium. And of course, we wish President Ramaphosa much luck.
And I guess the share price, South Africa share price, the rand, I think last night I was checking, it's about 18 rand odd to the US dollar, remained rather stable. Is this the case? I'm almost lucky that Trump has chosen so many different fights. There's so much noise around the White House that even this noise towards us, kind of in the market anyway, in its response, it doesn't have that much of a heft that South Africa is kind of in the crosshairs of the world's biggest economy. Does it, shield us from the worst effects market-wise from?
So the rand has been appreciating in large part because of a weaker dollar. It's what we would call default rand strength. So in a sense, it's not necessarily because overwhelmingly positive domestic fundamentals, but certainly to the extent that the rand's appreciation helps to, for instance, temper inflation, and with it open the prospect of further interest rate relief. We welcome it, whatever its genesis. We have trimmed our GDP growth forecast for this year. Initially, we anticipated about 1.8%. We're now looking at 1.3%, and that's mostly as a function of the global trade frictions, the dent to global uncertainty, some wobbles in the markets, particularly early in April. That said, there has been a fair degree of calm that has surfaced, and stock markets, for example, have rallied fairly handsomely from about April 8th. And bond markets have also seen a little bit more calm. And as I suggested a moment ago, the prospect of interest rate relief in South Africa is now somewhat greater than it was, say, only a few weeks ago. So one hopes that this calm can be maintained. Admittedly, when one looks at Trump 1.0, in other words, President Trump's first term, one noticed this perpetual throttling between the United States and China. So Sino-US relations were framed by America assailing China, draining concessions, shifting from trade to, for example, concerns that China is weakening its currency excessively to enhance its competitiveness, and that then triggers further frictions between the United States and China. So it was a process of throttling and calm, throttling and settlement. And one hopes that President Trump has also realized this flood the zone, shock and awe approach can also have damage to the United States economy. And we anticipate inflation in due course will rise, and in the latter half of this year, America is going to experience some weakness as a function of these policy choices.
I was looking at 2016 Trump 1.0. He's back again this time around. The question I have in my head, after the next 4 years, maybe this is just a cycle that we need to see through as everyone. I think our boss, because Sim spoke about seeing through the cycle. But after 4 years of, do you envision any return to normality? Is there any something we almost can we envision a place of back to normal, whatever that normal is, or like just over the next 4 years? Let's say okay, so let's ignore this noise. Do we then get back to some normal, or what? Like, or where do you come? I can't. Yeah, where do you see us going?
Ron, I think economists tend to use the phrase "new normal" too often.
Yeah.
But this is probably one instance where it's relevant. In other words, we are going to shift to a new equilibrium. And that equilibrium will have to recognize that geopolitically there is going to be an elevated level of tension. And that usually shows up, for example, in slightly higher interest rate risk premiums, the potential for more vulnerable countries to experience weaker currencies. And so that has to enter our frame. We also recognize, for example, that technology, which has largely been unconstrained for the last 30 years in terms of societal access, may now actually become constrained. We've seen, for example, the United States attempt to establish primacy with regard to microchip access, precluding China, or at least limiting China's access to more sophisticated microchips. And this is significant because it speaks to the existential potential of technology being a growth driver. And some countries want this comparative advantage over others. So this new normal that we're lurching to is certainly going to be different to the type of market and societal frameworks we were familiar with prior to COVID. We're not going to simply attach ourselves to the first quarter of 2020's norms. It's different. It's a new epoch and something that we've argued for some while, and we're going to have to condition it. Fortunately, Africans, South Africans, we're familiar with ruptures, deep fissures, and we can calibrate for it. So some steer that we must see through this, but at the same time adjust for it would probably be a sensible mantra.
And what speaks to locally, I guess, for the continent as well, just the importance of structural reforms. I know it's almost like a boring headline for big newspapers and so on, but it's the importance of adhering to them. So regardless of what shape the GNU takes, just the importance of sticking to structural reforms for South Africa going forward.
So when we talk about reforms, it's a little bit of a catch-all word. We tend to speak to the idea that there needs to be big fixes in a particular country, a particular location. Look, in terms of the global economy, the reform needs to be around the new rules of the global game. The US certainly seems to be wanting to reshape the rules, reframe its multilateralism. But the rules that have guided the global economy over the last 80 years are well known, and we need to have some level of cling to that, but at the same time recognize that those rules also had disadvantages for certain nations. They need to be remade. And I think, in a sense, maybe that's where America's resistance come from, in the sense that the rule of law, in a global sense, over the last 80 years benefited the developed world disproportionately. And now, while many of those rules are certainly worthy of clinging to, they need to be altered for greater, for example, emerging markets inclusion. And now, as we remake the world and the global order, and the G20 this year, that South Africa, of course, is hosting, can be a significant platform for that ambition. We need to make it with a greater sense of justice. We need to be assertive in that respect. In South Africa, when we say reforms, and this is just for illustration, we can, for example, be making reference to big repair in our electricity platforms, transportation, a big reset with regard to the way we approach crime, given the manner in which it certainly bedevils society so substantially. Reforms with regard to, for example, just the rule of law generally in South Africa, where that has been impinged and infringed upon substantially by many over the last decade or so, where it's compromised our general potential for growth and prosperity.
I've been to a few of your sessions and heard you speak, and I think, Goolam, it's always a pleasure being there. And I love the way you speak about, okay, growth frontiers. So Asia and where's that going? It's always a growth frontier that you highlight. And almost Africa is where in the league is, how excited are we about Africa's growth frontiers when we consider Europe as well as the US? What do you think of the continent as a whole in that sphere? Yeah.
Ron, for the last couple of years, we must cheer that sub-Saharan Africa has been the second fastest growing region on the planet, surpassed only by Asia. And Asia, of course, has been buoyed by China in particular. But I suspect in the remaining years of this decade, if not the next decade as well, sub-Saharan Africa could emerge as the world's fastest growing region. And in that respect, we celebrate the eastern shores of the continent, from Ethiopia through East Africa, and in time, quite possibly Mozambique as well. These nations have been able to muster more than 5% growth consistently. Favorably also, we're seeing reforms in Nigeria and Angola, where they've been somewhat of a slumber over the last couple of years, growing in low single digits. But the reforms underway there could also see them approaching mid-single digits in due course. Against a backdrop where China is beginning to slow and probably has a terminal growth rate in the vicinity of 4 to 5% over the ensuing years, that means the prospect for Africa is fairly favorable. And of course, we see new partners emerging, like the Middle East, to complement Asian outreach to the continent, and maybe even a recalibrated relationship with the United States means that from an investment, a trade, and just integration process, Africa can rewrite the books for its own good over the ensuing years.
Perhaps a more personal question, professional anyway, question to you. Populism and the choice of these popular economic decisions across the globe, this switch to the right, and almost a rejection of experts, and that's it's very clear in the West and how they speak about the economy, that there's an outright almost rejection of economic principles we've kind of understood from years of old. This season, what do you think about it for yourself personally, and just what do you think of this season of, your thoughts on that?
Ron, you've put your finger on a very critical feature of what is substantially informing the volatility in the global economy. And that is quite simply, we're seeing the emergence of populist leaders from the East and the West. And it's rooted quite simply in that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And in the poor, I also include the middle class, where there's been a great deal of stasis. They've been locked into the middle class for a length of time. And leaders are emerging, and we call them political big men, where they are seizing this angst, this sense of marginalization, and preferring economic policies to lift the poor out of poverty, to unlock the shackles of the middle class and provide them with a ladder into high income segments. And some of it will work, but for the most part, these could also be snake oil salesmen. So populism is being fashioned on a very legitimate concern of masses of society feeling disenfranchised, feeling locked and dislocated. One's mindful also that social upheaval rarely is a function of poverty, but it's related more to sense of inequality. It's where individuals certainly struggling, but see others around them enjoying income elevation and wealth building. And that then stokes this degree of angst and political irritation, which politicians potentially seize, and sometimes for their own interests. But I think it must still recognize that the world is searching for a new growth formula that is more equitable.
That's the hardest part of the interview. I have to close it. And also congratulate you, Liverpool, for winning the title. I am an Arsenal man, so this is very hard for me to do. But Goolam, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching this special edition of Standard Bank Talks, our Kingsmead Book Fair podcast. And look forward to seeing you at the next conversation.